Sunday evening and suffered a stroke. And in receiving emergency medical care and then follow-up treatment and then rehabilitation treatment, Gail was required to going back to being Glenn, to assume her male persona in order to get services.
When we started the task force, we did so because there was a void. There was a gap in services for Native people, and it seemed like nobody really cared.
When I found out that I was going to be the executive director, one of the first things I wanted to do was to go kind of see the work of the Black church and to support our staff person. So I went to one of their events, and to my total dismay, there was just overt homophobia. That was this was a youth event around sexuality education, and I was sitting in this pew, and hearing this rhetoric, and it was incredibly upsetting, as you can imagine.
It was obviously dramatic for Gail, but it was also sort of a hit upside the head to those of us within the church community, that this is an issue that is not going to go away, that this is one that the transgender community is facing. It's also a issue that older gay and lesbian people will begin having to deal with as they age and begin looking for help in the aging process from other people.
And so a few people got together and started to do this work, and we were very clear from the beginning that we were going to sidestep issues of sexuality, that we were going to deal with them in a forthright way, because if you don't, at that time I remember it was sort of like people didn't want to talk about sexuality, because talked about sexuality, then pretty soon you're going to have to talk about, LGBT folks, and that made everybody uncomfortable.
And to my surprise, as much as I've done a lot of work around race, it was hard not to feel that cultural imperialism rising. This is wrong. I have the power to stop this. And having to silence those voices and say, no, this is about the long road.
So 3 of us from Spirit of the Lake started an organization called GLBT Generations. And our goal was to begin educating both the GLBT community around aging issues, because for the most part, the GLBT community tends to ignore aging.
So what we would do in our early AIDS 101 was we talked about sexuality immediately, and we talked about, LGBT folks right away, because then people weren't sitting in their chair waiting for the, for the pin to drop, or you talked about it right away.
I left that day, and the first thing I did was, that night actually, I went to a friend of mine's house who was African American and a gay man living with AIDS, and was able to talk through it with him. And of course, as you can imagine, what he said is, no, this can't be happening in this community, and this needs to, we need to move away from this rhetoric. But it wasn't going to be me as a white woman saying, you're fired, or this has got to stop.
The property that Spirit of the Lakes owns on 13th and Lake Street has become very, very valuable. The renovation, the renaissance of Lake Street, the development hotbed that it's become has raised the value of our property. So we've had developers knock on the door and say, we'd like to pay you lots of money and send you to the suburbs. And Spirit has basically said, no, we've got things we want to do with this property that talk to our commitment to the neighborhood, that talk to our commitment to the work of generations and the aging process for GLBT people. We're going to stay here.
And we were an agency that created some of the first posters directed to men who have sex with men in the country. I believe that we were if we were not the first organization, we were one of the first organizations to create a lesbian brochure for HIV. It was really the elders who, stood by us, who opened our conferences, who came over and did sweat lodges with us and, gathered medicine and did namings for people.
So we're building a new church and 41 units of cooperative housing. We're marketing into the GLBT senior community. And it's a unique project that does a variety of things, not only responds to the issues around aging, but also commits ourselves to be supportive of the neighborhood. The neighborhood said, we have all the amenities. We need people. We have the Somali community has their shops, and the Latino community has its shops. We just need people in the neighborhood. And so that's one of the things that Spirit on Lake will bring to that neighborhood. Interesting aside, oftentimes neighborhood associations, when they see new projects of any size come in, get a little reluctant to have the neighborhood change dramatically. Spirit on Lake Housing Project they not only support it, they actually, the Midtown Phillips Group and the Powderhorn Neighborhood Association both donated money to the project.
People on the left in this country, I think, feel much more comfortable being in opposition than with governing. And at a certain point, if we're going to fight for social justice, we have to be able to actually enact social justice. And that's going to entail taking risks.
If there's anything that consistently is missing from coalition work, it's accountability, and it's kind of the same thing missing in the relationship between voters and their legislators. I think people are often unwilling to say, I'm going to be accountable, I'm responsible for mistakes I make, I will claim them when I make them. And whether it's a coalition around race or class or sexuality, when there are these cultural or lifestyle or religious issues that make them more complicated, at the very least you have to be accountable to one another, because that's the best way of saying, you can trust me. My word is my bond. I will follow through on what I said, and you can count on me to be there if I say I'm going to be there.
It also starts, I think, with having some strong conversations about race and racism. And when we talk about dismantling racism and what that means and how we define race, how LGBT people will say, well, I understand because I get a lot of homophobia, or I deal with a lot of heterosexism. And then you say, let's try to focus this conversation on race and racism, and then we'll save the heterosexism training for later. The anti-heterosexism training we'll do later. And I constantly need it as a straight person. I constantly need to be smacked on the head and reminded over and over again. But at the same time, I need you to hear me out when I'm talking about the racism that I have to suffer.
That All May Freely Serve it did start out as an organization that was working predominantly to change the church so that it was more inclusive for GLBT persons to serve. But over time, really through relationships, it realized that it was working for a lot more. It was working for justice with a capital J.
A lot of it calls upon, since I work for an organization that's predominantly white, for us to be that ally, and for us to show up and show that we are true in what we're saying, that it's not just mere rhetoric of racial and social justice.
I was driving home and I stopped at this thrift store, and there was a CD by Anne Reid. And Anne Reid is a lesbian singer-songwriter here in Minnesota, been around for 20 years, and everybody loves Anne Reid. And so I found the CD, and so I'm listening to it and singing along with the tape on the way home. And that night, I went to open my email, and there was this letter, and it said, "This is from Anne Reid." And I thought, well, isn't that a coincidence? She said that she had been traveling around the state, and Minnesota Public Radio was having, people send in ideas about a song for Minnesota, which would end up being this concert, Songs for Minnesota. I am looking for somebody to work with me on it, because of course I would not dream of doing this concert without recognizing Minnesota's dark side and the way that they have treated Native people, that I don't want to leave that out of the story.
We invited friends of color who were not on the board, or really who were a part of the organization but not in its leadership. And I think that as GLBT persons, we know what it feels like to be kind of walking curriculum, to be asked to do teaching, and that's not what we wanted. I think people of color know that feeling too, of having to go in and teach. But these were folks that we had kind of deep relationships with, and folks who could call us out, and that we could be accountable to, and we started kind of a dialogue process of how we could better work on each other's issues.
It's the issue of trust, right? Are they going to trust an all-white organization, or predominantly all-white organization? And I can understand that, you know, being a member of a ethnic group in America. We know the history, you know, and so it's about trust, and it's about building that alliance, building that relationship, and it starts with just showing up.
So I sent her some lyrics to a song that I had written. This year, the United States voted against the Indigenous Peoples' Declaration for Indigenous Rights, and it was United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia that voted against this declaration. And following that, I wrote this song that you know, that talks about, you know, like, we'll never forget. We'll never forget what's been done to our people. We'll never forget what's done to our land. And you know, in the lyrics describe that, you know, women, children, and babies, you know, were victims of genocide. You know, victims of this murderous greed. Then it talks about the land and what's happened to the land. And then at the end, you know, the song really talks about how we've always resisted, and we'll continue to resist. And so, and you know, there's some Ojibwe words that say "Ambe o Gichida," which means, you know, pay attention, warriors. And you know, it's really a call to sort of action.
I think a lot of people on our board and a lot of other organizations that were working for GLBT inclusion in the church were kind of like, what are you doing? I mean, you're really kind of halting your work. You're slowing down all of this kind of momentum towards queer ordination, and people were a little confused. But for us, it was like, exactly, this is what we need to spend our time doing.
In turn, because we've shown up, they've shown up. And that just happened at one of our public meetings last Thursday, where there were a lot of allies to show up. And that's because we had to take the first steps. There were a lot of steps along the way, so it's not like we showed up one time and that was it.
Just before we went on the stage to sing our second song, you know, I asked, you know, this was one point in time where, you know, to whoever the listening audience was, you know, where we get to tell our side of the story during, you know, this you know, of what statehood meant to Native people. You know, that this really was about, you know, not only genocide of a people in many ways, but, you know, cultural genocide, you know, the taking away of our cultural ways and our spiritual ways and our ceremonies. And so I prayed, you know, and it was the anniversary of my mom's death, and so I asked my mother to, you know, to come and be with us until, like, you know, all of the grandmothers and grandfathers that came before us, you know, to, like, be with us at that moment.
The folks from our organization spent, I think, 4 weekends throughout a year going and being trained, and this was kind of white folks training white folks on white privilege and anti-racism.
We sang the song, and it felt really good to me. You know, we were in sync, we were in time with each other. Then at the end of the song, you know, there's another song that we tacked on that is vocables. And so I was doing the lead of the song, and I could feel like chills, start from the back of my head and go all the way down my spine. And it just felt like, really right. And after the show was over, one of the singers said that he felt that same electricity, and I spoke to a friend of mine after the show, and she said it felt like that were all these people that came on the stage and were with us.
I think that's helped our community tenfold in that we have been able to go to General Assemblies and caucus with people of color, be at their events, work on their issues, and we see them too being a part of our movement, and us kind of working together on the margins.
And because of her sensibilities and her, just one individual though can change things. She had responsibility for this, creating this concert, Songs from Minnesota, and she determined that she would include the voice of Native people, and so she gave us that little space, 2 songs on the radio and in the concert, and it just felt good, and it felt like, like the ancestors were with us. It was a good thing.
We have a new frame that the church is on the margins. I mean, that's where we find Christ most completely, and that I think too, with others who are on the margins, we're inviting the church to the margins rather than, I think, people of color and us as the GLBTQ community have often been knocking on the door of the church, asking to come in, and I think we're saying no. We don't want predominantly white worship. We don't want, systems of hierarchy. We want the church to experience what we have, which is diverse and different. And so I think we've been better too at being authentic. And I think a huge piece of coalition building is being authentic and is meeting people in their fullness.
I refuse, for the most part, to be a part of those kinds of activities where, if we're not important enough to be invited in the beginning, then don't invite me to do the dishes later. After almost 20 years of talking to the same folks about the same issue, I'm tired of, trying to fix, the whole issues around, racism with